Hi, my name is Skip Stewart. I'm the Vice President and Chief Improvement Officer for Baptist Memorial Healthcare. Today we're going to cover a subject and a word that gets used often, but I'm not so sure that we always understand that word, and that word is the word culture. We're going to hear from an individual that actually coined the word organizational culture, and a father-son combination that has over 100 years of studying, thinking, and writing about this subject. In these videos, we're going to be looking at the structure of culture, the practice of culture, and then ultimately the dynamics of culture change. So let's learn together.
Hello again, folks. We've covered the structure of culture and the practice of culture. And just quick word of review, the structure is that notion of the things that we observe, and including artifacts, and then the things we hear, espoused values, and eventually the things that we learned, which are these underlying assumptions that are taken for granted and are assumed and are the very deepest levels of our culture. So that's the structure of culture. And then we talked about the practice of culture being the things that we experience on a daily basis in an organization. So it's our strategy, it's our mission. But then around that, we talked about it's sort of nested within the social culture, which is how we relate to each other, how we converse, how we confront. So that's our social culture, and that's all in the context of a macro culture, which is it may be our nationality, it may be where our business is operating, it's what's happening in the world. The macro culture is sort of our experience outside of work that obviously very strongly, but maybe indirectly influences our practice of our culture work. So today we're going to talk about the dynamics of culture change, and there's a couple points in here that I want to highlight. First of all, the idea of structure and practice came from a 1970s and 80s social anthropologist named Marshall Solins, who referred to the evolution of culture as being a continuous and reciprocal movement between the practice of the structure and the structure of the practice. Now that sounds like a very sort of strange academic double speak to try to figure out. But in reality, he describes how structure we might think of as conventions, and practice we might think of as intentions that are expressed on a daily basis at work. So the idea of structure and practice in this continuous iteration is sort of the basics of our notion of the dynamics of culture change. And so it's that interplay of intentions playing against conventions is how culture evolves over time. The other reason that we wanted to set the table in that way, to think of culture change that way, is so that we get away from the idea of a linear change program. So there's lots of ways that we can change what we do, and maybe particularly in our technical culture, and we can think of it in those linear change program terms, maybe the Cotter 8-step model, or some other, we use the acronym SMART for a change program that has a specific set of objectives and measurements, and we establish some benchmarks, and then we sort of grade it for success or failure at the end. And we also know that some crazy statistic like 10% of change programs actually succeed. Well, change programs succeed because they do change something. They may not change everything, and they may not, meet up to the sort of requirements that we established in those benchmarks at the beginning of our linear program here. But if you think of culture change, things do change in a continuous and reciprocal way. And part of the point of all of this is to recognize that those changes have to be observed, and we have to recognize which ones are positive, and we have to recognize that in many respects, we maybe it's unrealistic to think that we would change more than that with one set of new intentions or one set of new initiatives. So that's what the metaphor that we came up with to represent that idea of continuous and reciprocal, and honestly not really linear, but again more dynamic and more organic in the way things change. We don't change all at once in some linear way. We change over time in a continuous and reciprocal movement forward and movement backward. So with that, let's take a look at the picture, which is the notion of a beach, and our ideas of culture, leadership, and change are all captured in this picture. Ed, do you want to take it?
What I'd like to highlight now for us is this word dynamic and iterative and perpetual change. Because when you work with culture, when you're either as a manager, or as a leader, or as a consultant, thinking about how culture actually changes, what actually happens, we had to very quickly abandon the original metaphor, many of you will recall, was the iceberg. And that's about the worst possible metaphor for the dynamics of culture. So think of the beach as fixing all the problems that the iceberg created, namely that in the organization, culture is perpetually evolving, and we think that a beach is a pretty good model for that, because a model highlights that there is a beach that is always there. The culture is always there, but it is perpetually changing as the action of the waves and the tides come in and go out, which are bringing new stuff in, taking stuff out. And all that is driven by at least two kinds of winds. One is the tailwind, which we can think of as technology. As technology changes, or as leadership decides that there's a whole new way we have to think about our market and so on, that becomes a force for change. And as we'll explain, the wave action, the tsunamis that occasionally occur, represents that technology and leadership change that's there. But then we think about it, well, what about resistance to change, which we always encounter? That's really the headwind that acts against the change, because a lot of the occupants of the beach like the way the beach it is. They don't want perpetual change. So this beach model, which we will now explain in greater detail, attempts to access the reality of what culture change actually is, rather than looking at a photograph or a structural one-time shot. Think of this perpetual action that a beach metaphor illuminates and enhances. So let's start with Peter explaining some of these actions.
So as Ed was describing, suppose there's a new technology that's going to change the business. It's going to change the way people work. It's going to change what products we produce. And leadership recognizes this and creates a new initiative expressing a new set of intentions that wash change over the organization. And that might mean we do some reorganizing, we do some rebudgeting, we elevate some new leaders to take on new tasks and roles. And also this could be, it doesn't have to be technology. It could also be there's a new competitor, or there's, you know, some sort of new geographical opportunity that a company wants to seize, that wants to capitalize on. And so these new ideas and initiatives, and these can be small, or as Ed said, they can be tsunami level initiatives, major reorg as an example, wash over the organization. And imagine you're standing on the beach and you're feeling how the sand underneath you changes as a wave washes over your feet. You can feel it changing. But then, as Ed was saying, just one other thing about the headwind, it's important to think of whatever the leader has in mind, creating that wave that creates a wash on the beach, on the organization. The contour of that wave is always going to be impacted by the headwind. So if there's a strong offshore breeze, the shape of the wave is going to be dramatically impacted, or by that resistance, if you will. That's the notion of the wind blowing against waves as the shore, meaning the conventions, pushing back against a new leadership initiative. So the tailwinds and the headwinds shape the contour of that wave, in the same sense that the tailwind, the positive energy to create a change, is shapes an initiative, but also the resistance, the natural resistance to change that's very human and very common, again, changes how that wash, how that initiative interacts with the land or the conventions that we're used to every day. So I think we can go to the next one. And we've sort of talked about this resistance. And just before, Ed, I'll ask you if you have any other thing to comment here, but the one other part of the metaphor is this idea of backwash, which is, again, imagine you're standing on the beach and you feel that initial settling of the sand as the wave sort of ends and settles. But then you feel the backwash, the reciprocal of that is the force that's pushing back against that change and resettling the sand after that initial initiative. So, Ed, do you have any other comments about that resistance?
To add a couple of further thoughts on why the beach is such a good metaphor, because you also know that there are a lot of people who say that every time you go to work, you also are changing the culture in some way. Well, that's true, but the amount of change relative to the occasional tsunami is small. And I think the tides are a very good symbol of that. The tides are perpetual. People are always coming to work. There is life on the beach that has to deal with the tides, which are the daily changes, the weather, the market, everything is perpetually in motion. So this idea that even you, by your own behavior, are changing to some degree the culture is valid, but relatively it's small compared to a leadership initiative that is really trying intentionally to make a major change. So it's perpetual, but it differs in intensity.
All right, let's take a look at the last picture here then, which is the idea of, if we think of culture here as the shore, the solid structure, which is, lots of sedimentary layers of initiatives that have come before it. The process of washing and backwashing and over time resettling the shore and ultimately changing the contours of the shore are our metaphor for how culture change happens over time, in response to leadership iterations. And those leadership iterations are, of course, in response to outside forces, opportunities or threats that the leader realizes the organization has to respond to. So rather than thinking of it, again, as something that just there's point A and point B, and culture change is the thing in between, think of it as this continuous resettling of the sand. And as that sand settles, it changes the contours of the land over time. Again, all in response to leadership initiatives that are compelled by tailwinds and resisted by headwinds. So with that, that's the essence of the beach generative metaphor for culture change. And Ed, do you have any other comments?
Well, metaphor should be a creative stimulus rather than taken literally. So for me, what's important is that if we think of this dynamic process, it is possible to think about, well, what kind of life is there on the beach? Or do leaders create breakwaters that control the action of the waves? Think of this as a stimulus to how the things that are actually going on in your real life, in your cultural life, really have this perpetual, dynamic, iterative quality.
Great.
In the first video, we spoke about the structure of culture. In the second video, we spoke about the practice of culture. And today, we ended it with speaking about the dynamics of culture change.